and Mr. Antonio Vitorino, the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. It is so decided. Ms. Kelly Clements and Mr. Antonio Vitorino are joining via video teleconference. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Kelly T. Clements.
Madam President, thank you for inviting UNHCR to the Security Council to discuss the situation in Ukraine. I'm joining you tonight from Hungary, a country to which almost 500,000 Ukrainians have fled, a fraction of the almost 5 million who have been forced to leave their country, in addition to the over 7 million who remain displaced inside Ukraine. The UN also estimates that there are 13 million more in the hardest hit areas, many unable to move and difficult to reach with aid safely. Earlier today, I was in the Czech Republic, and before that in Austria, and the compassion and solidarity in these countries, along with others, continues to be unprecedented. Our fervent wish is that this will also extend to other refugees uprooted from their homes and who find themselves on this continent, unable to return and in need of the same international protection and solidarity. My own visit, which will continue to the Slovak Republic, complements those of High Commissioner Grandi, including to Ukraine, and Raouf Mazou, Assistant High Commissioner for Operations, who was in Moldova and Romania since he addressed this council. And while the sheer scale and speed of displacement is immense, we must not lose sight of what these figures mean. Our teams on the ground continue to be confronted by the same scenes and shared stories. Women, children, and the aged have left their homes, their lives, their sons, their fathers, and husbands. Just this morning in Prague, I met Lupa, a 25-year-old from Odessa. Like so many others, she was forced to leave behind her family in Ukraine. Her father, a military reservist, remains there with her mother. Her grandmother, who lives in Mariupol, just a few hours west of Mariupol, has been completely unreachable since the war began 2 months ago. Each one of the millions of displaced are forced to make impossible, heartbreaking decisions and have left everything, almost everything, they hold dear. But we have also seen consistently remarkable acts of humanity. Apartment and office buildings, windows and balconies, street lamps on every corner, covered with messages of support. Local authorities, communities, and individuals rallying to provide what they can, food and medicine, transportation, and a place to sleep. I saw this in Prague today, tremendous solidarity and support. Thanks to the commitment of concerned states, borders have been kept open, those seeking safety are given access to protection and aid, and we call on that to continue in a non-discriminatory manner for all people in need. This inspiring response is surpassed only by the strength and composure of refugees themselves, who continue to exude both courage and resilience as they describe their flight to safety, bravely talking about being separated from their families, fearful the war will pursue them, and most of all, they emphasize their hope for peace so that they can return home as soon as possible. Many are therefore staying close to Ukraine. Some are even returning now, anxious to connect with family and check on property. Madam President, Excellencies, some in this council may have joined the briefing last week by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, when he described the chilling scene in Bucha and throughout Ukraine. Heartbreaking stories of those killed, those lucky to escape, and those left behind or with loved ones whose whereabouts remain unknown. Dire humanitarian conditions for civilians forced to withstand unrelenting fighting, but also tireless efforts from many to save lives and help people in besieged areas like Mariupol. When the High Commissioner visited Ukraine 2 weeks ago, he spoke with the government about scaling up cash assistance to reach 360,000 vulnerable people inside the country. He also conveyed our commitment to extend our expertise in shelter to help those with damaged homes and repair of reception centers. UNHCR is now signing agreements with 3 key ministries in Ukraine to take this work forward in support of the government, which is determinedly leading this effort. Let me reiterate what the High Commissioner conveyed at that time, that we will continue to expand our life-saving aid to the internally displaced throughout Ukraine, especially in the center and the east, where a brutal humanitarian nightmare is unfolding. This requires not just resources, but also safe and unhindered access to people in need, wherever they are in the country, so that they too can receive desperately needed help safely. Madam President, I want to stress that even as news coverage has shifted to other aspects of the conflict, people are still fleeing in desperation and fear, and not just from Ukraine, but from other countries in turmoil around the world: Yemen, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Syria, Venezuela, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the list goes on. We ask this Council to continue, even as we focus today on Ukraine, to consider the needs of all refugees from all corners of the globe. All those uprooted from their homes need the same solidarity, the same compassion, the same protection. In Ukraine, the vast majority of those on the move are women and children, and the risks of gender-based violence, trafficking, and sexual exploitation and abuse are high. Anecdotal information is already coming in about persons approaching the displaced with too good to be true promises of work, accommodation, and transport. The first identified cases of trafficking confirm that these risks are coming true. As UNHCR, we are working, including with Antonio's organization, IOM, to prevent, mitigate, and respond to these trafficking risks. In addition to strengthened gender-based violence programs, we have deployed expert coordinators in preventing sexual exploitation and abuse to support government's response. We also partner with UNICEF on safe spaces called Blue Dots at main border crossing points, transit, and reception centers to provide information and specialized aid for mothers, adolescents, children, and other vulnerable refugees. This is the first time we have done this so early in an emergency response, and we expect it will serve as a best practice going forward. States, however, have the strongest role to play, especially on trafficking. We call upon them to end the impunity of traffickers, help identify international protection needs of survivors and persons at risk, and most of all, redouble efforts to address the root causes of the conflict, which allows predators to exploit the opportunities that war presents. Madam President, we will continue our work to provide life-saving aid in Ukraine, and at the same time, neighboring countries are increasingly, and in line with the Global Compact on Refugees, including refugees in national education, health, and social programs. This inclusive approach is, bar none, the best way for refugees to sustain their lives in exile, and it requires more international support. But no pile of blankets, no sum of cash, no amount of medicine is going to halt the death and destruction. Aid alone will not stop people forced by war to flee, nor will it give them what they really want and need: peace and safety at home, a chance to return voluntarily, sustainably, and safely. And so while we will continue to do our job to deliver aid, we need this Council to do its job too. And when the High Commissioner last addressed this body, he warned that without an immediate end to the shelling, we were planning for up to 4 million refugees. Now, 8 weeks into the conflict, we are at 5 million and counting, with 5 million unique stories of loss and trauma. We therefore call on all of you in this Council again, and yes, we are aware of the deep divisions, to put aside your differences and find a way to end this horrific and senseless war. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Clements for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Antonio Vitorino.
Thank you so much, Madam President, and thank you for giving to IOM the opportunity to speak to you today. As it has just been said by Kelly, more than 12 million Ukrainians and third country nationals have already been forced to leave their homes since the beginning of this war. About 5 million people have fled the country, according to the data collected by UNHCR. Another 7.1 million people are displaced inside Ukraine, according to the latest assessment by IOM's displacement tracking metrics. Through our displacement tool, I hope that by the end of this week, I can provide you with the update of the overall figures concerning new displacements, secondary movements, stranded populations, as well as the increasing numbers of returns to Ukraine and inside the country returning to regions of origin. But we remain deeply concerned about the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, as we anticipate the increase in displacements, internal as well as external. Therefore, I appeal to parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, their homes, and the civilian infrastructure. When I recently visited some of the concerned neighboring countries, I saw firsthand the price that civilians are paying for this conflict. Women and children, the elderly, and people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected, as they all represent a highly vulnerable group of people. Madam President, from our assessments and work with all UN agencies in Ukraine and our NGO partners, we have identified specific risks for internally displaced people, refugees, and third country nationals. And I would like just to highlight a few of them today. First, in situations of mass displacement, one can always expect to 30% of the population to experience some form of negative psychological impact and mental health problems. However, as the war continues and even intensifies, psychosocial needs will undoubtedly further increase. We are scaling up our efforts to address them in Ukraine and in neighboring countries through activities ranging from training first-line responders in psychosocial first aid to increasing the capacity of our established hotlines that provide psychosocial support. For that purpose, we are benefiting from the mobilization of the Ukrainian diaspora worldwide. Second, we remain particularly concerned about the situation of women and children who have fled Ukraine, who are internally displaced. Trafficking in persons was unfortunately a known phenomenon in the region, and as observed in past crises, large-scale displacement, family separation, and the disruption of civil protection and community networks render populations vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and abuse. Therefore, I think that it is of utmost concern that gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, has been reported and in increasing numbers. Setting referral mechanisms and developing close cooperation with law enforcement agencies is essential to prevent the operation of criminal networks of trafficking and abuse. We know that more than half of the children in Ukraine have been displaced. Unaccompanied or separated children are particularly vulnerable, and measures to protect them must be strengthened. I urge the neighboring and impacted countries to ensure that immediate identification and registration of unaccompanied and separated children fleeing from Ukraine is done. Effective international cooperation is required urgently to reunite children with their caregivers and their families. Third, we applaud all of Ukraine's neighboring countries for the solidarity and openness they have shown, and the enormous efforts undertaken by their governments, civil society organizations, and private individuals to support arriving Ukrainians and more than 218,000 third country nationals. Despite the overwhelming positive response, we have unfortunately witnessed cases of discrimination, violence, and xenophobia against third country nationals fleeing Ukraine. Discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, or migration status, in my view, is not acceptable. Therefore, I call on all states to ensure that protection and immediate assistance is provided in a non-discriminatory manner, particularly in border crossing points. From our side, we have set up information and support hotlines for affected populations in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and Slovakia. And we have established a referral mechanism to facilitate contact between third country nationals and relevant consulates and to ensure safe, dignified, and non-discriminatory support, information sharing and advice, transportation and medical assistance, and support to return to their countries of origin. We see now that internally displaced people tend to move to urban areas in search of possible employment opportunities and social services. There will be an urgent need to scale up the services and the assistance to meet the needs of an increased population in these areas, as we are doing in close cooperation with the Social Policy Ministry of the Ukrainian government. Of particular concern is the situation in the east of Ukraine in terms of access to food and to water. Since the start of the response to the crisis, we have all identified cash-based interventions as one of the most feasible, efficient, and effective ways to reach people in need, both inside Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. IOM has already started providing multi-purpose cash assistance in Ukraine and in some of the neighboring countries. And as Kelly has just mentioned to you, preparations are ongoing to scale up this assistance in close coordination with UNHCR and WFP, with the government of Ukraine and the local authorities. But funding for this purpose is badly needed. Madam President, moving forward, it is necessary that we seek to better understand the intentions of those who are fleeing, those forced to leave their homes, and those who have been separated from their families due to the ongoing conflict. Many, particularly in neighboring countries, are willing to return to Ukraine as soon as possible, but of course, return must be safe. We are working with the government and local authorities concerning, above all, those internally displaced in order to support the identification for this group of stable and safe solutions. For those who have left the country, it is crucial to plan ahead and invest in order to ensure that all have access to adequate support and services, and to facilitate their full inclusion in educational and health systems, into the labor market, provide language opportunities, social housing, and other needed support. We welcome the decision by the European Union to offer temporary protection to those fleeing Ukraine, and I reiterate our readiness to support with implementing the directive. Madam President, let me just conclude by reiterating our commitment to stay and deliver in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries, to support and to provide assistance to the Ukrainians and third country nationals that are so severely impacted by the war. And I will just add that I want to reiterate and strongly echo the Secretary General's repeated call for an urgent, very urgent humanitarian ceasefire, and above all, for peace. Yes, for peace. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Vitorino for his briefing. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Director General and Deputy High Commissioner. As we meet this afternoon, we do so in the shadow of a renewed offensive by Russian forces on eastern Ukraine, in the shadow of further bloodshed, further scenes of killing, further disregard for civilian lives, and of continued blatant violations of the UN Charter. On Thursday of last week, I travelled to Kyiv. I did so because I wanted to see for myself the situation on the ground and to express Ireland's solidarity with Ukraine and its people. What I saw was profoundly shocking. During my visit, I went to Bucha. Until 2 months ago, it was a pleasant and vibrant town, a place where many of us around this table could have happily imagined living in. It now lies in ruins, with the stench of burning buildings and bodies in the air. Hundreds of family homes, shops and other civilian infrastructure blackened, burnt, looted, damaged, and in some cases completely destroyed. Family cars riddled with bullets, windshields smashed, bloodstains still evident. I've been around long enough to know the difference between truth and staged propaganda when I see it. There was nothing fabricated about what I witnessed. I stood at the edge of one of the mass graves, where the work of carefully exhuming bodies continued. 503 civilians had been identified at that stage, and just 4 soldiers. Men, women, and children who were not combatants, yet who appeared to have been deliberately killed in a brutal manner, some cases after being tortured. We have seen across Ukraine explosive weapons, including prohibited cluster munitions, being used in populated areas against civilian infrastructure. The toll of destruction of homes, hospitals, and schools is testament to that. It does speak of an utter disregard by Russian forces for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. There is no spinning that reality away with disinformation. Madam President, Ireland is a small country. We are not a member of any military alliance, and we are certainly no superpower. But we fought to take a seat at this table, and we have earned the right to be here. We did so because we fundamentally believe that despite all the well-documented flaws of this Council, and there are many, it is the ultimate arbiter on matters of war and peace. This group of 15 countries has been entrusted with protecting the weak and the innocent, with holding aggressors to account, no matter how powerful they are. The only weapons that we have are diplomacy, dialogue, facts, collective leadership, and most importantly, a shared commitment to international law and the UN Charter. Do we really have to keep repeating around this table that innocent civilians are never legitimate targets of war? That all parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to distinguish between civilians and combatants. These obligations are not optional, not least for those privileged enough to be seated around this table, who should be leading by example. During my visit to Ukraine, so many people spoke to me about the urgent need for accountability, to expose the horrors of what has happened to them, preferably in a court of law. In all situations where war crimes may have been committed, we must ensure that timely, credible investigations are undertaken, that evidence is rigorously documented, and that witnesses, victims, and survivors are supported. And for that reason, Ireland has committed an additional €3 million of funding to the ICC last week. Without accountability and truth, there is no hope for sustainable peace. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Madam President, Russia's war has driven millions of Ukrainians from their homes, as we've just heard. Almost 5 million people have become refugees, and over 7 million have become displaced internally in Ukraine. But the humanitarian consequences of this war are also felt thousands of miles from Ukraine by some of the most vulnerable people on our planet. Countries across the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, but also in Latin America, are increasingly impacted by the severe economic consequences of this conflict. The price of wheat and oil has risen by 300% in Somalia, where more than 700,000 people are already displaced by drought. Wheat reserves in Palestine could be depleted in less than 3 weeks' time. As the UN Security Council, or as the UN Security General has said so clearly, the most vulnerable people around the globe cannot become collateral damage in yet another disaster for which they bear no responsibility. Ireland cannot and will not remain silent while this senseless and devastating war continues, and neither should any member of this Council. As it was on the 25th of February, so it is today. This is a war of choice, and it can end immediately if President Putin so decides. And yet, instead, we are seeing a renewed and upscaled offensive in eastern Ukraine. This is madness that history will judge very harshly. We have to find a way to stop this war, and this Council has a unique responsibility to do that. I want to call today on Russia directly. Agree to an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Commit to negotiations. Respect this charter. We know that some progress was made in Istanbul between the key parties. There is clearly a basis for a peace agreement. President Zelensky, to his credit, has constantly remained open to diplomatic solutions in the face of aggression and brutality against his people. I hear the narrative from far too many quarters that peace is only possible after the battle for Donbass. I can't accept that logic, a logic that leads directly to further death, further suffering, further displacement. This Council must challenge that thinking today and every day. We must demand more. Thank you, Chair.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Coveney for his statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would like to thank the High Commissioner, Madam Clements, and the Director General of the IOM, International Organization for Migration, Antonio Vitorino, for their briefings. And I'd like to recognize the President of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland, whom we just listened to with great attention and to whom we would like to welcome to this meeting. Mexico and France have requested this meeting, and we did so in light of the many humanitarian consequences of the Ukraine conflict, specifically the massive exodus of people to neighboring countries and the displacement of persons to places that are less safe within the country. Those in the east of Ukraine have been forced to flee towards the west in order to try and seek more protection. In that sense, it's deplorable that there was a recent attack on a city that has welcomed hundreds of internally displaced persons. On the eve of 2 months since the beginning of this war has, as the briefers presented today, left us with more than 7 million internally displaced persons and some 5 million refugees, 90% of which are women and children who are exposed to all kinds of abuses. As in any conflict, the risk of gender-based violence is very high, but what's clearly dominating in terms of age and gender in the case of Ukraine has multiplied this effect. The situation on the ground presents logistical and statistical challenges which are complex in order to collect specific and precise information on the numbers of women and children who have been victims of traffickers. And although the number is very significant, what's even more significant is each and every person who's at risk of being taken advantage by opportunistic criminals who would exploit their vulnerability in their capacity as refugees or nationals of third countries. All measures possible for this Council should be taken in order to prevent that from happening. Given this situation, we recognize the efforts both of the UNHCR and the IOM and other agencies on the ground who, working together with national authorities of Ukraine and neighboring countries, they are able to address and tackle this issue. We would especially like to recognize the efforts of agencies in the area of mental health and psychosocial support provided. The centers of protection, such as the Blue Dots for families and children, and campaigns such as Stay Safe to protect any person who needs specialized assistance are laudable because they're crucial. And in many cases, they are the only alternative of support for these people. Mexico once again recognizes the solidarity of those to Ukraine who have welcomed millions of refugees and supports UNICEF's efforts to provide assistance and support systems of protection for boys and girls. Also, we would like to once again stress the fundamental collaboration of host countries in order to combat trafficking and abuses. Amongst the very horrific images that this conflict have left, what we would highlight: discrimination, xenophobia against third country nationals. There is no justification for acts of discrimination or rejection due to ethnicity, religion, gender, nationality, migratory status, or people who are in critical situations where the lives of people are at stake. We support the new call of the Secretary General for a humanitarian pause, to limit the civilian population which is most exposed, to give them time to find safer places, and we would insist on the need to investigate any incident which violates the rights of refugees. To conclude, Madam President, if I may, I would like to make a couple of final comments. First, one of the main challenges for humanitarian personnel continues to be the problem of access. It is therefore vital to guarantee safe and unlimited, unimpeded access, and we exhort and urge all parties to facilitate immediate access. Second, reports on violations of human rights and international humanitarian law cannot go unpunished. It's fundamental that this Security Council meet the need of parties signing on to international law and respecting it, and in addition to insisting on relevant investigations being conducted and activating mechanisms for justice which are available to us. And finally, we would reiterate that the only way to put an end to this serious humanitarian crisis would be a cessation of hostilities. Mexico once again calls for an end to this war and support for the territorial integrity of Ukraine in keeping with its internationally recognized borders. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I wish to thank Madam Clements and Mr. Vitorino for their briefings. I applaud the remarkable efforts undertaken by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and of the IOM. These are the efforts undertaken by UN agencies and all humanitarian actors, both in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. You can continue to count on France's full support. All efforts need to focus on the delivery of assistance and the hosting of refugees without any distinction or discrimination. More than 1/4 of the Ukrainian population has been forced to flee. Nearly 5 million people have had to seek refuge in neighboring states. The ongoing Russian aggression will inevitably continue to have an impact on displacements of populations. France hails the solidarity that has been demonstrated by the European Union, member states, and other European states such as Moldova. The launch of the European Directive on Temporary Protection has resulted in the delivery of prompt and effective assistance to people fleeing war. Refugees thereby inside the European Union have access to education, medical care, and employment. We also applaud the initiatives of the IOM in delivery of assistance in the organization of the return of third state nationals, including those from African states. There's a vital need to continue efforts to that end. It is also our duty to step up efforts to counter the trafficking in human persons. 90% of displaced persons are women and children. Thousands are unaccompanied and vulnerable. Madam President, the Russian army has been killing for nearly 2 months now, killing civilians, including children, killing humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as journalists. Schools and water infrastructure has been destroyed. 1.4 million people lack access to water in East Ukraine. Hospitals are also being targeted. The World Health Organization has confirmed 136 attacks targeting medical infrastructure. I wish to recall the fact that murders and maimings of children, as well as attacks targeting schools and hospitals, constitute grave violations of children in wartime. These crimes will not be left unpunished. France will remain committed alongside the Ukrainians in international and national jurisdiction, specifically the International Criminal Court, to that end. In the wake of the heinous atrocities perpetrated in Bucha, France deployed a technical team tasked with delivering expertise for the identification and the compilation and collection of evidence. We support the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council in the establishment of the facts. Madam President, we call upon the Russian Federation to respect the ruling handed down by the International Court of Justice and to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. The top priority is an immediate cessation of hostilities and full respect for international humanitarian law. The protection of civilians is an overriding objective. Humanitarian access needs to be delivered. In this regard, we fully support the call of the Secretary General for a 4-day humanitarian pause beginning this Thursday. The entire world has been affected by this war, which is liable to cause up to 1.7 billion people, nearly 1/5 of the global population, to come face to face with poverty and food insecurity. There's an urgent need to act. As we are set to commemorate in the next few days the opening of the San Francisco Conference 77 years ago, France will continue to stand in solidarity with partners to ensure respect for the UN Charter and to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Madam Clemens from the UNHCR and Mr. Vitorino from the IOM for their very edifying briefings, and I also welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence from Ireland, Mr. Simon Cornet. Madam President, day to day we see a heavier toll caused by the war. Some 12 million people affected since the beginning of hostilities. The number of refugees stands at some 5 million, most of which are women and children who have sought refuge in Poland and other neighboring countries. Amongst those refugees, we find more than 200,000 citizens from third countries, including Africans, for whom the exodus is often more difficult because of absurd discrimination levied against them. We cannot stop calling upon neighboring countries to consider the situation of these people who, like other victims of the war, do not deserve less compassion or rescue as granted to other victims of the war. This is one of the most concerning issues. The civilians, attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructures are particularly devastating and impact public services such as water and electricity and gas, which then lead to health risks. At the same time, the welcoming ability and hosting abilities of the United Nations agencies can barely cover the needs of the number of people constantly on the rise due to combats and constant movement of peoples. Humanitarian organizations in Ukraine and around Ukraine are all at bursting point, trying to bring vital assistance to those people who are most in need with basic services, specialized services, including mental health care and psychological care, as well as different types of assistance geared to facilitating registry, school for children, or employment for refugees. We welcome the support for the workers and express our support for all the humanitarian workers and those countries welcoming refugees. We applaud the work of the UNHCR and the IOM. Without this precious assistance, the daily lives of many refugees would be, no doubt, even worse, which is why we reiterate our appeal to host countries to assist all those countries that are fleeing the combat without distinction of country of origin. All of these people live in fear, in distress. Madam President, a few days ago, this council met to address the allegations of sexual crimes, crimes of exploitation of women and children, and the risk of trafficking. It has become common that trafficking networks become vultures, preying on those who are in distress and without defense and who need protection. We all remember the terrible stories of this kind that have happened in the past, and we need to be vigilant in order to stop them in their tracks and stop all of these types of networks, be they in Ukraine or working in host country. A number of testimonies have described rape, children who are alone and without defense who are picked up on roads of exodus. If these reports are true and found to be true, then these are serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, as well as sexual violence linked to conflicts, in violation of resolutions of this Council, including 2106 and 1325. My country condemns any attack on women, children, or civilian who is not involved in the hostilities. Also, my country reiterates its appeal for impartial, independent investigations to be conducted into these situations and determine the offenders. We once again reiterate Gabon's appeal for a cessation of hostilities. It is time for the fighting to stop. It is time for the weapons to be silenced. It is time for diplomacy to express itself and to put an end to the suffering and death of innocent people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and I thank UNHCR and IOM for setting out the devastating human consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We are appalled by Russia's ongoing offensive in Donbass and the relentless attack against civilians and vital civilian infrastructure across Ukraine, including in urban areas. Russia has intentionally created a humanitarian disaster, particularly in Mariupol, where civilians have been trapped in cellars for weeks without food, water, electricity, medicines, and other basic necessities. At the same time, Russia continues to carry out missile attacks in Kyiv and Lviv. Nobody is safe in any part of Ukraine. As we have heard today, 12 million Ukrainians have now fled their homes. As internally displaced persons or refugees, they face increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, abuse, psychosocial trauma, and family separation. Russia is solely responsible for creating this situation. All Russian attacks on civilians must stop. Russia's invasion is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We welcome the investigation of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity opened by the ICC prosecutor and the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine. There must be accountability. Perpetrators must be brought to justice. President, Russia is choosing to cause the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Norway echoes the Secretary General's calls for a humanitarian pause to allow safe passage for civilians and delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid. The brutality and sheer scale of this rapidly evolving crisis put civilians at great risk and demands protection responses at unprecedented levels. From local communities, areas receiving internally displaced people and refugees, to international humanitarian organizations, and so many in between. All countries receiving displaced people must ensure immediate identification and registration and put in place measures to protect them from further risks and harm. Women and children account for 90% of all those who have fled Ukraine. The response must therefore be gender and age sensitive and tailored to meet distinct needs, with particular attention paid to unaccompanied children who are extremely vulnerable. Access to education and health services, including for sexual and reproductive health, must also be a top priority. President, Norway is impressed by the resilience of the people of Ukraine. Local services, communities, and responders, even those affected by the conflict themselves, continue to serve people in need. And we commend the response mounted by local and international humanitarian organizations. As the needs grow, so much the effort to step up the response and engagement directly with affected people. We continue to call for safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need. We applaud also the hospitality and solidarity extended by Ukraine's neighbors, and we encourage countries to keep their borders open to all those seeking protection without discrimination. Russia alone is responsible for the war in Ukraine and for the devastating global consequences. We are acutely aware of the war's negative impact on the cost of staple foods, fertilizer, and energy across the globe, and how it exacerbates poverty, food insecurity, and humanitarian needs. Russia can choose to stop this war, to end the aggression against its neighbor. This is the only way to end the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the views voiced by the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Madam Kelly Clements, and the Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Antonio Vitorino. We have heard in your statements a large number of alarming conclusions and terrifying figures. In this context, it behooves us to recall that the Russian Federation has encountered the consequences of the deteriorating situation in Ukraine immediately after what took place there in February 2014. I refer to the anti-constitutional coup. As soon as the nationalist authorities showed their real face, beginning unleashing a war against the Russian language and then undertaking the physical destruction of the residents of the East, Russia was flooded with refugees who were fleeing the Maidan lawlessness. According to official reports alone, since 2014, those turning to the Russian Federation for citizenship, refugee status, or temporary shelter was, at the very least, 1.7 million people immediately after the shelling of Donbass by the Ukrainians, immediately before the Russian special military operation. This flow increased considerably and reached 863,000 people. So since the coup at the Maidan, more than at least 2.5 million people have sought refuge in Russia. It behooves us to recall that the mass exodus of Ukrainians from their country is nothing new for that state. According to the data of the Ukrainian Financial Ministry, from 1990 to 2021, the country's population was reduced by a quarter, from 54 to 41 million people. At the same time, according to data from the Ukrainian Demography Institute, in 2021, there were even fewer Ukrainians, 38 million people. It is noteworthy that the number of Ukrainians traveling for seasonal labor, according to that same institute, was 3 million people. I am providing you with these figures not to downplay the scale of the migration challenges that Ukraine has been encountering and which its neighbors have also been encountering. I merely wish to not agree with attempts to erase the history of post-Soviet Ukraine, attempts to turn a blind eye to all of its problems, and attempts to address the situation from the beginning of the operation. Today, our Western colleagues prefer not to mention. Not just do they prefer to overlook the growing rate of emigration from Ukraine, which has gained ground in recent years, as I mentioned, but they also prefer to overlook the staggering corruption, staggering political murders, many perpetrators of which remain unpunished, unprecedented repressions targeting opposition leaders, the mass closures of opposition media outlets, and this list goes on. Those who reproach us of human rights violations fail to recall the unprecedented persecution against the Russian language carriers and the Russian language in that country. Of course, while praising Ukraine, it is awkward to talk about the Peacekeeper site, which remains operational and provides the personal data of inconvenient Ukrainians and foreigners who criticize the Maidan regime. Among those whose lives are in this way imperiled, there are also minors. Assessments of this disgraceful phenomenon is something which our Western colleagues prefer not to proffer. Madam President, in painting your picture of the world, you are striving to portray Ukraine as some kind of a pure, innocent white lamb. This picture does not include the 8-year war of the Kiev regime against their own residents in the east, the many years protracted sabotage of the Minsk agreements, and since you are trying to prompt others to forget about this with the threat of sanctions and direct political and economic blackmail. Moreover, having baselessly attempting to portray what has taken place since 24 February as an unprovoked, unprecedented Russian aggression or war of trace, you hypocritically make it appear as if nothing worse transpired in the world since the end of the Second World War. Sweeping under the rug the hundreds of thousands of victims since the end of Cold War, victims of the military misadventures of Western states in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yugoslavia, and Libya. Just yesterday, our Syrian colleagues circulated a letter at the Security Council about the horrific consequences of the Americans razing the city of Raqqa to the ground in 2017. This operation was edifying for the inhumane actions which resulted in this city being virtually reduced to rubble along with its civilians. Today, in this way, you are attempting not only to rewrite history in an anti-Russian bent, but you are trying to overlook the role of the USSR in the liberation of Europe and the world as a whole from fascism. In this way, apparently it is easier for you not to notice the egregious manifestations of Nazism in Ukraine, denazification of which is one of the main goals of our military operation. This is necessary to ensure that this soil never again have a threat emanating to other states or the people of DPR or LPR or the Russian Federation. Madam President, it also behooves me to note that the concerns of our Western colleagues about Ukraine and Ukrainians are very short-sighted and egotistical in nature. Today, they are necessary for you merely as cannon fodder in your direct war against the Russian Federation to the last Ukrainian. At the same time, you have your own interests at the top of your mind. The weapons producers in Western countries are eagerly rubbing their hands, calculating their profits from increased demand on military products. After the first week of hostilities in Ukraine, the cost of the stock of the leading British arms producer BAE Systems rose by 24%, and the stock value of Thales Company, which is a producer of anti-tank and anti-air facilities, has rose by 42%. And we have seen the same trends with the U.S. war industry. This is clearly to the liking of NATO, Eastern European NATO members who have long been thinking about how to rid themselves of obsolete Soviet weapons. And they have been giving Ukraine vehicles which no longer work. And they know that the Russian army will grind and crush this non-functional equipment, and they will no longer have to think about its disposal. Not limiting themselves to this, our pragmatic U.S. colleagues, without an iota of conscience, are now attempting to reap the maximum in economic profits in prompting Europeans to engage in increasingly stringent economic sanctions. Washington, which suffers the least of all from this, intends to have other states become addicted to their gas products. The American liquefied natural gas products are considerably more expensive than Russians. And yet this is a molecule of freedom, according to, as was mentioned by a U.S. official, which the Americans will not pay for, but the Europeans will pay for. The Russian economy, as is known, is doing fine under circumstances of sanctions pressure, with new areas of development and new reliable partners. The only country that is losing in all respects as a result of the situation is Ukraine. And yet, apparently, it seems that the authorities in Kiev have either not noticed this or prefer not to notice this. And however, ordinary Ukrainians understand this. From the beginning of the special military operations, they have not been encountering terror, nor have they been encountering Russian shelling, contrary to the attempts by propagandists, but they have encountered the ruthless hostility and indifference against their own population that has been shown on the part of Ukrainian neo-Nazis and radicals who have been seeking to save their own skins at all costs. Evidence of civilians being used as human shields, indiscriminate shellings of residential areas in their own cities in order to pin blame on Russian military personnel is an egregious tradition, very much akin to Goebbels' tradition in provocations, and this is seen in the provocations such as in Bucha, Kramatorsk, at the maternity hospital, and the drama theater in Mariupol. And these numbers, such incidents, the list continues to grow with each passing day. It is not possible to sweep the truth about this under the rug. And the fact that the Ukrainian military has been using prohibited cluster munitions in the shelling of residential infrastructure cannot be swept under the rug either. This morning, cluster munitions targeted Golovchina in Belgorod Oblast, where there are no military facilities located. All evidence has been registered. However, a willingness to condemn this heinous crime and the radicals' breach of the norms of IHL is something which, for some reason, we do not see Western colleagues doing. The same radicals and neo-Nazis are openly using our military to seek cover in the Azov steel plant, have continuously claimed that they have had civilians behind them this entire time. And this, despite the fact that they did not report this until yesterday, nor did they mention any civilians, even when the encircled military personnel moved to surrender. And in this way, they once again disclose the truth. The civilians in that facility were only there to be used as human shields. There's a multitude of such evidence, and we will, without fail, share this with you. But will you wish to hear about this, to see this? For 8 years, you studiously preferred not to notice the deaths of civilians, women, children, the elderly in Donbass, and based on that, we have doubts about this. We are carrying out the special operation not to be for understanding or support from you. It would be naive to trust on your support in this geopolitical game which you have unleashed, where you use Ukraine as a mere pawn in your game. The dirty tricks which you are prepared to utilize for forging a so-called rules-based world order is something which we became convinced of when we saw that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, instead of monitoring and reporting on violations of the ceasefire, simply spied on Kyiv, handing over to Ukraine information from surveillance cameras for them to adjust their firing positions and targets. A collection of evidence about this very inconvenient fact is ongoing. However, another issue warrants specific attention. I refer to the use by the Ukrainian armed forces of the OSCE mission's armored vehicles. According to media outlets, since late February, Azov fighters turned up in the office of the Special Monitoring Mission in Mariupol with demands for the vehicles' keys to be handed over. They threatened the staff with guns, and ultimately, this was OSCE vehicle was used for those purposes. And one of these vehicles was ultimately found 5 kilometers from the Special Monitoring Mission's office in the Kirov market in Mariupol. Not a single one of these vehicles which were taken were returned to the OSCE. There were similar threats targeting the monitoring mission staff in Severodonetsk in late February, early March. The OSCE leadership was aware of this issue. However, they preferred to sweep this fact under the rug until the last moment. These disclosures undermine trust in any international organizations whose senior officials include Western countries' representatives. I will not conceal the fact that under these circumstances, calls for peace and a ceasefire sound mendacious and insincere, and in practice, they merely point to an aspiration to provide the Kyiv nationals and radicals breathing room to regroup, to receive more drones, more anti-tank guided missiles, and more man-pads. And this is an attempt to stage more inhumane provocations and to introduce more fakes about the alleged actions of the Russian soldiers. Such kind of tactical pseudo-peacekeeping calls is something which we will disassociate from a genuine intent to help Ukraine to adopt the real and appropriate and correct course of action. And the sooner this is done by Ukraine, contrary to the inclinations that are egging them on, those who wish to gain profit from the tragedy that has been unfolding since 2014, including the European Union's leadership, which has set aside its masks. The sooner this is done by the Ukrainians, the better for that country, because in one way or another, the objective of the special military operation to liberate Donbass, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and to eradicate the threats emanating from that area against the Russian Federation will certainly be achieved. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, at the outset, I thank Director General Vitorino and Deputy High Commissioner Clements for their briefings. The Ukraine conflict has triggered a dire humanitarian situation and other serious consequences. We are deeply concerned about this. Here, I would like to make 4 comments. First, every effort must be made to reduce the harm to civilians caused by conflict. China once again calls on all parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint, strictly abide by international humanitarian law, protect civilians in civilian facilities, and facilitate evacuation and humanitarian assistance operations. The parties concerned should strengthen communication on humanitarian issues and conduct coordination and cooperation on issues such as opening humanitarian corridors and organizing the safe evacuation of personnel. China supports Secretary General Guterres and USG Griffiths in engaging with all parties on the humanitarian pause and on agreeing on relevant arrangements. Second, the issue of refugees should be properly addressed. The neighboring countries of Ukraine have provided safe havens and humanitarian assistance to millions of refugees, which China appreciates. The continuation of the conflict will result in more refugees and bring huge economic and social challenges to the host countries. The international community should strengthen coordination and provide more support to refugee-receiving countries in the spirit of shared responsibility. UNHCR, IMO, and other agencies should continue to mobilize and coordinate international aid, scale up humanitarian assistance to refugees, and help ease the pressure on host countries. We have noticed that in the past few days, many refugees have returned to Ukraine, and we hope that their basic needs will be met as they return to normal life. All refugees, regardless of nationality, race, or religion, should be treated equally. Vulnerable groups such as women and children should be given priority protection. Actions must be taken to crack down on human trafficking and other criminal activities targeting women and children seeking refuge. Agencies such as UNHCR, UN Women, UNICEF, and OHCHR should also step up monitoring in support of the efforts of relevant countries. Third, diplomatic negotiations must be promoted with a greater sense of urgency. The prospect of an extended and prolonged conflict is worrying. A ceasefire and an end to the conflict as soon as possible is the fundamental way to resolve the humanitarian crisis. We call on Russia and Ukraine to adhere to the general direction of dialogue and negotiation, continuously narrow differences, and accumulate conditions for a ceasefire. All other parties should focus on supporting diplomatic negotiations. Continuing to send more heavy or offensive weapons will not bring peace. It will only prolong and escalate conflict, which will further aggravate humanitarian catastrophe. Fourth, we must pay attention to and eliminate the negative impact of sanctions. All dimensional and limitless sanctions have had serious spillover effects, with developing countries bearing the brunt. Last week, at the launch of the first report of the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance, Secretary General Guterres said, I quote, "We are now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries," unquote. The vast number of developing countries that are not parties to the conflict have paid a heavy price for it. This is neither fair nor reasonable. The international community should strengthen coordination to keep food and energy supplies and prices stable and avoid unnecessary export restrictions. It should also be pointed out that arbitrary freeze of foreign exchange reserve of other countries also constitutes a violation of the sovereignty of other countries and is tantamount to weaponizing economic independence. Such practices undermine the foundation of world economic stability and bring new uncertainties and risks to international relations, which should be abandoned as soon as possible. Madam President, China has always stood on the side of peace and justice and stood by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. We will continue to work tirelessly for a final resolution of the Ukraine crisis. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'd like to also thank Deputy High Commissioner Clements and Director General Victorino for your informative briefings on the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Right now, your agencies and NGO partners are doing such important life-saving work. Your teams are putting their own lives on the line as they work to assist others. We were heartbroken to hear about the Caritas International staff that were killed in Mariupol. I met with the Caritas staff when I was in the region, and I saw the life-saving work they were doing. Their deaths are tragic and unacceptable. Humanitarian aid workers do save lives. They are impartial, and they should be protected, not shelled indiscriminately. As we heard, Russia's unprovoked, unconscionable war keeps generating new, sobering milestones. As of the latest count, 5 million refugees have left Ukraine in search of safety. Of course, the number of people internally displaced in Ukraine is even greater. And yes, these numbers are alarming. Today, I'd like to focus on what we can do to both help refugees and to help those frontline countries protect those searching for safety. I want to start by thanking the countries who have initially taken in the vast majority of refugees: Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia. These frontline countries deserve our sincere and heartfelt gratitude for their service and their sacrifice. You've opened your borders and your hearts to the people of Ukraine. And you've not just done the right thing, but you've also done the hard thing. I saw for myself when I visited Moldova and Romania just how difficult and disruptive it can be for societies to integrate so many refugees in such a short period of time. But I speak on behalf of many when I say that you've given us all hope for humanity. You've shown the world what it means to be gracious, to be hospitable, to be generous, and to be kind, what it means to be a good neighbor. And I'm so glad that many refugees from Ukraine are now being hosted by other European Union countries. That greatly alleviates the impact for all. For our part, the United States is welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians, and we're funding efforts to support all those who have fled Ukraine. As we do everything we can to support Ukrainian refugees, all of us need to provide just as much support, protection, and grace to the many third country nationals fleeing Ukraine. As I've said before, refugees are refugees, no matter their background, their race, their religion, or the country they come from, regardless of their age, their abilities, their nationality, irrespective of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or creed. Refugees are refugees, period. Upholding the human rights of those in need is of paramount concern, and I'm proud that my government has contributed to these efforts. National Geographic recently highlighted some of the stories of the refugees fleeing Ukraine, and they featured some of the thousands of Africans, many of whom were students, who were living in Ukraine and had to flee the country. And I was particularly moved by the story of one, a young woman by the name of Blessing Oyeleke. She was a 25-year-old medical student from Nigeria who escaped Ternopil. Blessing had lived in Ukraine for 5 years, and she told reporters, "Coming to Ukraine was like a dream come true to me." You don't have to be a citizen of Ukraine to have your dreams dashed or your heart split in half. So we're beyond grateful to the countries who have shown such generosity and hospitality and let in all those who are fleeing for their lives. Finally, as Director General Victorino made clear, we also need to address the threat of human trafficking. Because refugees and other displaced people have limited access to resources and employment and often lack proper identification documents, they are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and human trafficking. And as we emphasized last week, 90% of this refugee population are women and children. They face immense risk of being trafficked, exploited, and experiencing gender-based violence. And we must do everything we can to mitigate those risks. I know some countries like Poland and Romania are conducting targeted awareness campaigns and also taking specific preventative measures like instituting checks at the border and facilitating access to shelter and transportation. The United States is proud to provide support for those important protection initiatives, both in Ukraine and also in neighboring countries like Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. To that end, on my trip to the region, I announced $50 million in additional assistance to Moldova, much of which went to border management and anti-human trafficking efforts. With so many lives on the line, we must all increase our vigilance and support for anti-trafficking initiatives, as well as resources for survivors and accountability for those who exploit the most vulnerable. We cannot let the world's most nefarious actors take a horrific situation and make it worse. But we need to work together. Supporting countries, partner organizations, UN agencies need to coordinate to ensure we are doing everything we can to help the countries on the front lines of this refugee crisis and the millions of people fleeing from violence. Yesterday, the Secretary General called for a humanitarian pause to allow for humanitarian corridors to open. Every day I'm asked, is the UN, even is the Security Council, irrelevant to this crisis? We know that the world is looking to the UN and wondering how to respond in the wake of Russia's unconscionable actions. Supporting refugees and the countries taking them in is one of the most powerful and immediate ways that we all can help, and it is so important that the UN plays a key role in that. So let's show the world what we have learned from decades of addressing refugee crises and humanitarian situations. Let's show the world that when Russia provoked the worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II, the rest of the Security Council and the United Nations stepped up and helped those most in need. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Madam President, I'd like to thank the briefers for their important contributions. Let me also take this opportunity to reiterate our solidarity to all victims of this war, including those that lost their homes and are now fleeing in fear. Europe is facing its fastest growing refugee crisis since the Second World War. The UNHCR and IOM, which were created precisely in the aftermath of that war, are now playing a crucial role in offering protection and relief to millions of refugees and internally displaced persons in Ukraine and other parts of the world. We are deeply concerned with the fact that nearly 1/4 of Ukraine's population have been forcibly displaced in the past weeks, a figure that's a testimony to the intensity of the conflict and the degree of disruption of normal life it is inflicting upon Ukrainians. Many more may follow if hostilities continue to increase in eastern and southern Ukraine and in densely populated areas. The high proportion of women and children fleeing Ukraine is also concerning, as they are more vulnerable to sexual violence, exploitation, and human trafficking, not to mention psychological impacts of the conflict on children and on the prospects of their future development. All parties have an obligation to protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure and to ensure the safe, timely, and unimpeded humanitarian access, especially in eastern Ukraine. Furthermore, the opening of humanitarian corridors and the establishment of local humanitarian pauses are positive steps, but only a nationwide ceasefire will allow for an effective protection of the civilian population. The conflict is now creating a looming food crisis with devastating impacts on the most vulnerable across the world. The destruction of Ukraine's productive capacities on one side and the unilateral economic sanctions on the other both carry concrete weight on the surge of global food insecurity. All this comes at a time when developing countries are still struggling with the socio-economic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. The fact that the World Food Programme recently announced a reduction in its assistance for refugees and other vulnerable populations across East Africa and the Middle East illustrate this problem. As David Beasley recently reminded us in a different context, we should not be forced to take from the hungry to feed the starving. Let us not forget that developing countries host approximately 85% of the world's refugees. Prices of food, energy, and fertilizers have been increasing very steeply worldwide. The FAO has published data according to which food prices are now more than 30% higher than this time last year. Since fertilizers prices have doubled, the medium and long-term effects on agriculture are also concerning. In fact, the Secretary General made reference on April 13 to this dangerous three-dimensional crisis, and the UN Global Crisis Response Group came up with its first report on the same day. Madam President, in line with our tradition of solidarity, since March 3rd, Brazilian embassies in Bratislava, Bucharest, Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw have been granting special visas for displaced Ukrainians and stateless persons affected or displaced by the armed conflict in Ukraine. Once in Brazilian territory, they have full access to all public services and social benefits on an equal footing with Brazilian nationals. Brazilian civil society has been forthcoming in mobilizing to provide further specialized assistance to help local integration. Such measure is part of a long-standing Brazilian humanitarian visa policy that already benefited persons affected by crises in Afghanistan, Haiti, Syria, and Venezuela. In doing so, we attest that there should not be discrimination against any person or group currently fleeing armed conflicts. They all deserve support regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, migration, age, disability, and other status. We welcome the demonstrations of international solidarity with Ukrainian refugees and host countries. This is precisely the attitude we need to foster globally if we are to face the immensely complicated humanitarian landscape of our time, marked by a rapid multiplication of crises and situations of forced displacement in many regions of the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking IOM Director General Antonio Vitorino and Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Ms. Kelly Clements, for their respective briefings on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine has deteriorated further since the Council last discussed this issue. From reports coming out of Ukraine, women and children have been disproportionately impacted, and they form the bulk of the refugees and IDPs. We support calls urging for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies, including through establishment of permanent humanitarian corridors. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors, which include medicines and other essential relief material. We are providing more medical supplies to Ukraine in the coming days ahead. India has also ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. To that end, we initiated Operation Ganga involving 90 flights. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. The impact of the situation is being felt beyond the region, with increasing food and energy costs, especially for many developing countries. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the issue. We have noted the findings of Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group task team issued last week. We welcome their recommendation for exempting purchases of food by WFP for humanitarian assistance from food export restrictions with immediate effect. The food security challenges emanating from Ukraine conflict requires us to respond creatively. The growing shortages can only be addressed by going beyond constraints that bind us presently. Energy security is equally a serious concern and needs to be addressed through cooperative efforts. Madam President, allow me to reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation and reiterates its call for immediate cessation of violence and end to hostilities. We have emphasized right from the beginning of the conflict the need to pursue the path of diplomacy and dialogue. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. We continue to emphasize to all member states of the UN that the global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Madam President, let me thank Director General Vitorino and Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Ms. Clements, for their update information on the situation in Ukraine. There is unfortunately no good news coming from Ukraine, only more of a never-ending tragedy. Every briefer from the UN system that comes in the Council echoes the same concerns, sounds the same alarms, and highlights the same issues. The situation in Ukraine is dire, and it's worsening. We are running out of words to describe the continued terrible human suffering, the deliberate large-scale destruction, and the exacerbating humanitarian needs. But we are not running out of rage and condemnation of what should have never happened in the first place. All moral red lines have been crossed by Russia, knowingly, willingly, and on purpose. The war of aggression remains as brutal as on its first day. Russia continues to impose its inhuman behavior and ruthless vision on its neighbor. They continue to slaughter civilians, they continue to destroy the country, they persist in killing hope. In a matter of weeks, the war managed to defy the wildest of projections, since, as we heard from Ms. Clements, over 5 million people have crossed the border since 24 February 2022. Add to that over 7.1 million people that have been internally displaced, uprooted from their homes, and another 13 million people affected by this special madness. And the picture is apocalyptic. The country is upside down. These people, mostly women, girls, and children, have left everything behind. They have lost their homes, they are dispossessed of their lives, deprived of their dreams. They are only left with the made-in-Russia nightmares. Dear colleagues, A major assault has started in the east of Ukraine. It was anticipated, and we need not to be told what Russia will do there. Mariupol, Bucha, Cherniv are the calamitous templates that anticipate more of the same ruthlessness. There will be more victims and destruction, more suffering and atrocities, more children hurt. This shows that the so-called negotiations were never sincere. They were only a tactical bully to force Ukraine into concessions, a move to gain time, regroup, to inflict more pain. We welcome the work of the UN agencies and their international partners, including those who are in risk and losing their lives, like the worker from Caritas, in helping millions in need wherever possible, inside and outside the country, needs that, as we heard from the briefers, continue to grow exponentially. As no ceasefire is anywhere on the horizon, which we deeply regret, safe passage must be ensured to allow the safe evacuation of civilians. The SG has called for a humanitarian pause. We support his call, but will he be heard? All must be done to protect people vulnerable to trafficking inside Ukraine or those at risk while fleeing the country. We applaud the generosity, the hospitality, and the measures taken by the neighboring countries and others in welcoming Ukrainian refugees and providing them with access to labor market, healthcare, and social benefits. Dear colleagues, everything is under attack in Ukraine: freedom, property, rights, and life itself. Where there are no ground troops, there will be deadly missiles falling from the sky. Alarming reports of arbitrary detention of civilians, forced deportation, and increased conflict-related sexual violence in territories under the Russian control are appalling and must be fully investigated. Accountability is central in our collective efforts to suppress, and I hope to prevent, acts of aggression. We applaud the visit of ICC prosecutor Khan to the crime scenes. Gathering evidence for the purpose of accountability for the atrocities committed in Ukraine remains key not only for delivering on a commitment, but also for taking responsibility at all levels to establish truth and end impunity. Dear colleagues, one may be sometimes skeptical of media reports here and there. To be properly informed, there is always need for critical thinking. But it would be hard to object to the credibility of the New Yorker magazine. Their latest investigative report on the siege of Cherniv is petrifying. And I quote, "The siege lasted 39 days, and according to the city's mayor, killed some 700 people, though countless more died as a result of freezing temperatures, lack of medical care, and shortages of food and medicines. Residential buildings were struck with terrifying regularity. Even the Yuri Gagarin stadium was flattened," end of quote. It could hardly be otherwise. When you attack hospitals and schools, you are not fighting against an army. You are aiming at the destruction of a population. Nina Rogasheva, a 92 years old, in a hospital bed, badly wounded. She was 11 years old when her family got the news that her father, fighting with the Red Army in the Second World War, was killed on the front. She says, amidst tears, "My father died defending Russia, and now that same Russia is bombing me." Madam President, let me end with this note. In order to enforce its long-claimed obsession, Ukraine doesn't exist. Kremlin resorted to brute force coupled with totalitarian censorship back home in an attempt to force the reality to meet the myth. What has happened in the course of the last 7 weeks shows the contrary. Reality is hard to deny, and misreading history may result into disaster. History serves not only to bear proof of what has happened in the past, but also to draw lessons and not to repeat mistakes in the future. I cannot help but go back for a moment to November 1939. Stalin decided to invade Finland. He wanted a part of it and was convinced it would be over in a matter of days. What happened was a different story in everything. The outnumbered Finnish resistance, some 3,600 people, inflicted a humiliating defeat to the 25,000-strong Soviet division of that time. For Stalin, it was a territorial grab move. For the Finns, an existential threat. No might can defeat the brave hearts of the right. What matters to recall is that the Soviet Union wanted to Sovietize Europe. It tried and it failed. The same attempt to impose one man's rule, one man's concept, one man's foolish dream is failing again, with humiliation for the aggressor, but unfortunately with dramatic consequences for Ukraine and serious disruption for the world. This is why Russia's war of choice concerns not only the fate of 44 million Ukrainians, it concerns all of us because we must not allow one country to bully the world into submission. No, no country should be free to dominate others. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking the Director General of the International Organization of Migration, Mr. Antonio Vitorino, and Ms. Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, for their comprehensive briefings and the dedicated work of their teams in Ukraine as well as in the neighboring countries through the implementation of the interagency regional refugee response plan spearheaded by the UNHCR. Madam President, too many people have needlessly been thrust into the stark and painful realities of becoming refugees and internally displaced persons since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. In just 7 weeks, almost 5 million people living in Ukraine have been forced to flee into neighboring countries, and some 7 million more internally displaced, with little or no hope of ever returning to their known places of abode and domicile. We commend the willingness of neighboring countries, most of whom themselves are still in fragile situations, for opening their borders to receive the exodus of people arriving daily from Ukraine. We also thank particularly those families and individuals who have generously offered to share their homes and continue to contribute food and non-food items to help assuage the needs of the refugees. We urge the sustenance of cooperation between the United Nations agencies, host governments, and the relevant stakeholders to ensure that refugee assistance and protection measures conform with the internationally accepted standards defined by the 1951 United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees and its amending protocol of 1967. Madam President, Ghana is particularly concerned over the reports of discriminatory treatment of third country nationals, either in their endeavor to join the trains and buses transporting people out of Ukraine or in their attempt to cross the borders into the safer territories of neighboring countries. We believe that even in the most challenging circumstances, the best of our common humanity would come true if we are committed. We therefore condemn all differential treatments based on race, color, nationality, or any other distinguishing criteria, and call for the equal treatment and protection of all refugees and IDPs. In particular, we urge the easing of border controls to facilitate the entry and passage of third country nationals. We further urge host countries to refrain from forced deportations and alternatively, to provide third country nationals with assistance on the legal options to remain or voluntary return to their countries of nationality. We remain alert to the risk that such mass movements of persons pose, especially in the area of human trafficking, and urge the strengthening of oversight and accountability measures, including in transit and host countries. We call for the prioritization of the peculiar needs of the sick, women, children, elderly, and persons living with disabilities, while underscoring that all reported cases of crimes and violations of human rights, including human trafficking, gender-based and sexual violence against the women and girls, must be urgently and independently investigated to establish the culpability of those responsible and hold them accountable. Madam President, the continuous bombardment in several parts of Ukraine has intensified the need for negotiated humanitarian pauses and demilitarized humanitarian corridors for the safe passage of persons leaving the war-torn country, and which would allow for the unobstructed delivery of life-saving aid and assistance to those who are unable to leave. We further reiterate our call on the parties to respect and uphold their obligations under the international humanitarian law and to refrain from direct attacks on civilian populations and civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian workers and medical personnel must also be protected from harm. Our desire to see an end not only to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, but the fast-growing food, energy, and financial crisis that is being spawned globally as a result of the war should drive our efforts to facilitate the peaceful settlement of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. We therefore have an urgent and collective responsibility to invest in the peace of Ukraine and avoid actions that reinforce the security apprehensions of the parties and only serve to perpetuate a needless war. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Deputy High Commissioner Kelly Clements and Director General Antonio Vitorino for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished permanent representatives of Ukraine, Sweden, Italy, Poland, Estonia, and Slovakia. Madam President, the scale of the Ukrainian exodus escaping war is unprecedented in recent history. With the continuation of the aggression, which is causing this humanitarian catastrophe, the number of refugees will only continue to increase. We commend the rapid mobilization by humanitarian actors, including but not limited to OCHA, UNHCR, IOM, and the ICRC. We urge them to redouble their efforts to ensure that the refugees from Ukraine are protected from forms of modern slavery such as forced labor and forced marriage. The security services of receiving countries should also make every effort to ensure that these victims of war are protected from the predation that so often comes to those who have fled their countries. We further recognize with praise Ukraine's neighbors for so generously opening their borders to the millions of Ukrainians and other nationals fleeing in fear of violence and atrocity. We continue to urge them to ensure that all refugees, no matter their race, national origin, or religion, deserve the equal protection in line with international humanitarian law. We call on the Russian Federation to end the war and to return to its important responsibility of protecting international peace and security. Ending the war is the only way to put an end to the humanitarian crisis underway. Continuing it will lead to more suffering and a steady erosion of the legitimacy and status of the United Nations, no matter its efforts to provide humanitarian relief. We further urge all actors to ensure that there are safe humanitarian corridors provided in Mariupol, Kherson, and other besieged cities. The Africans trapped in those cities should be protected by all actors, not only from the harms of bombs and bullets, but from racist treatment. Madam President, the war is leading to hunger and poverty all over the world. Ukraine's inability to safely harvest, transport, and export its commodities and goods due to the war is adding to food insecurity globally. The sanctions, which are unprecedented in scope, are also impacting global food and energy prices. We urge the largest shareholders in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to mobilize these funds to offer far-reaching efforts to cushion the world's most vulnerable countries. It is a particular concern that fertilizers should be made available to those countries that suffer from chronic food insecurity. But we must go further than offering alms to the poor and victimized. The extent of this crisis should impel us to bold leadership in providing a viable development path to the poorest countries, particularly in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Madam President, every crisis has important lessons that can help us heal in a way that gives birth to a kinder and fairer world. One of those lessons is to recognize and act on the profound danger to all of us from ethnocentrism and racism in all their manifestations. A few weeks ago, we shared our delegation's interaction with an African student who had been studying medicine in Ukraine. She told us of the many thousands of Africans who, like her, had to make a terrifying journey to flee the war and find refuge in Europe. She spoke of the indignities and dangers they experienced from the racist treatment they received along the way. A similar story can be told by the thousands who seek to cross the Mediterranean from Africa, or travel overland from Asia and the Middle East into Europe. These are not merely refugee policies. They are pointers to a fundamental flaw in the global order. It is our contention that racism and ethnocentrism, especially when they're supported and trumpeted by official policies, are the clearest early warning signals of catastrophic war and atrocity. Since we are speaking of a war in Europe, Europe knows from its tragic history and understands all too well the horrors that emerge when the full violent logic of racism and ethnocentrism can mobilize armies. This very United Nations was established after the policies of race and pseudoscientific racism of the Nazis, which built on the legacies that had generated the transatlantic slavery and other forms of violent racism in the Americas and Europe, killed tens of millions of Europeans, Asians, and Africans. To prevent a new age of destructive wars and their associated humanitarian crisis, we must build anti-racism into the very foundations of the multilateral order. From how the United Nations agencies are led and work, to refugee and climate change policies, and even in regard to Security Council reform, we must embrace anti-racism as the greatest preventive action to humanitarian emergencies. Madam President, in closing, as regards the specific humanitarian crisis in Ukraine today, the most humane action that can be undertaken is a cessation of hostilities. We call for that cessation, and one that has clearly defined contact lines and humanitarian corridors, and a cessation that sets a foundation for a lasting peace settlement that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I now give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I'd like to thank Director General Antonio Vitorino and Deputy High Commissioner Kelly Clements for their valuable briefings. As we heard from today's briefers, and in all our meetings on Ukraine since the conflict began almost 2 months ago, the human costs of the war are staggering. In a clear example of the toll the conflict has taken, more than a quarter of Ukrainians have fled their homes in this short period of time, 90% of whom are women and children. We call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law. We also reiterate that an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine is imperative to move towards a peaceful solution to the war. We welcome in this regard the Secretary General's call for a 4-day humanitarian pause to allow for the opening of a series of humanitarian corridors. This would help preserve lives, prevent and alleviate suffering, and protect civilians. More broadly, in the context of the current situation, I would like to focus on 4 points. First, dialogue remains the only way to sustainably end this conflict. The UAE supports the ongoing negotiations between the parties, and we support all good faith efforts aimed at reaching a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all peace efforts must be guaranteed, considering their critical role in building a more sustainable and durable peace. Second, the human suffering of the conflict requires significant resources to render aid to those in need. In particular, we commend the generosity of neighboring countries and others in hosting large numbers of refugees, particularly Poland and Romania, who together have taken in more than 3.4 million Ukrainians, as well as Moldova, which has taken in more than 400,000 refugees, amounting to 15% of its total population. We also commend the European Union for its ongoing support to states bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis. Additionally, the UAE recognizes with appreciation the work of the UNHCR and the IOM in supporting refugees in host countries. Their work is essential to provide ongoing care and reassurance after many have lost so much in the war. We also reiterate our call to allow civilians to safely and voluntarily evacuate from conflict-affected areas and for humanitarian aid to reach those in need. in accordance with international law. Third, we reiterate the need for a gender-responsive approach to be implemented in all humanitarian efforts in Ukraine and host countries. We are particularly concerned about increasing reports of human trafficking, ensuring that structured systems are put in place at border crossings to vet assistance providers and to detect, prevent, and suppress the criminal activity of traffickers is essential to ensure the safety of women and children. In that context, the humanitarian response must include the voices of women who can inform the provision and delivery of humanitarian assistance, services, and programming efforts with their needs at the center. Fourth, we need to also address the global impacts of the conflict in Ukraine urgently and effectively. This is especially critical as we have seen the sharp rise in food and commodity prices, including in many countries on this Council's agenda. To conclude, we should spare no effort to end the conflict and the ongoing humanitarian strategy through diplomacy, and the UAE will support any initiative to this end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Kelly Clements and Antonio Vitorino for their briefings. And as we've heard today, the people of Ukraine continue to bear the terrible costs of Russia's invasion. And as Russia begins a new offensive on the Donbass, millions of Ukrainians face further suffering. Our consideration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine must be guided by two overarching principles: protection of civilians and prosecution of war crimes. After 55 days of war, 7.1 million people are displaced within Ukraine, and 4.7 million people have fled to neighbouring countries. And like others, I pay tribute to the compassion and solidarity of neighbouring countries who are hosting refugees, and the work of the UN, in particular the UNHCR and the IOM, for their initiatives, and in particular the Blue Dot Initiative to protect unaccompanied women and children who may face sexual exploitation, abuse, and suffering. Many Ukrainians, including children, have been forcibly deported against their will to Russia. They should be allowed to leave in safety and with dignity. For the thousands of civilians remaining in Mariupol, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and other cities, struggling to survive without food, water, warmth, and medical supplies, the UK joins others in supporting the Secretary-General's call for an urgent humanitarian pause to allow assistance to reach civilians in the hardest hit areas. And to this end, the UK has pledged almost £400 million in aid to Ukraine and is a leading humanitarian donor, providing £220 million of humanitarian assistance to deliver life-saving assistance and support countries receiving and hosting refugees. We have also guaranteed $1 billion in World Bank lending to Ukraine. Second, the prosecution of war crimes. For those who suffered in Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Chernihiv, and many other towns from Russian forces' occupation and atrocities, let there be no doubt that justice will be sought for these crimes against humanity. We welcome the International Criminal Court investigations led by Karim Khan, which are underway. As the prosecutor said, Ukraine is now a crime scene. The investigations of the appalling sexual violence in Ukraine will be informed by the Murad Code, which we launched here last week, and are a vital step towards supporting survivors and bringing perpetrators to justice. For the sake of those we could not protect from violence, there must be prosecution of those who committed it. Finally, we should not ignore the looming humanitarian needs caused by secondary displacements, as the economic consequences of this war translate into rising food, energy and finance costs, exposing more than 1.2 billion people in 69 countries to perfect storm conditions. The urgent and simple solution to this humanitarian crisis is for President Putin to stop the war. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. First of all, I would like to thank Minister Coveney, as well as Director General of IOM, Antonio Vitorino, and the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Kelly Clements, for their statement and briefings. Distinguished colleagues, yesterday morning, surgeons in Lviv carried out an operation on a 3-year-old boy by the name Miron, an IDP from Kharkiv. His family left the east of Ukraine in an attempt to save their child from the Russian shelling. Unfortunately, Russian rocket attacks against Ukrainians have no bounds, and Miron's family came under a Russian airstrike on the other side of Ukraine, while in the vicinity of a car service center hit by a Russian cruise missile. Fortunately, Miron survived. Unlike 7 other people killed by this airstrike on Lviv, unlike 3 people killed by Russian shells in his native Kharkiv just today, unlike many other Ukrainians whom Russia is killing right now. One may like to ask Putin's representative how the attempted murder of a 3-year-old boy near a car service center in Lviv could protect Donbass from neo-Nazis. But I will not do that, as it would simply be a waste of time to listen to another lie that the Russian representative is feeding us to justify what cannot be justified. Let their deeds speak for themselves, and they are sinister. It was also yesterday that Putin granted the 64th Motorized Infantry Brigade of the Russian Army with the honorary title of Guard Brigade. As an argument, Putin referred to so-called, I quote, mass heroism and valor, tenacity and courage, end of quote, of the soldiers of the above brigade. Let it be remembered that the 64th Brigade was supposed to seize Kiev according to the initial Russian plans. They failed and were deployed in the town of Bucha for almost the whole of March. A month that was turned into a period of terror against civilian population of the occupied town. The soldiers of this brigade, and many of them have already been identified, and they are responsible for mass atrocities in Bucha. That is the Russian interpretation of heroism and courage: to kill hundreds of unarmed civilians, to rape dozens of women and girls, and finally to flee from the advancing Ukrainian forces. one could only agree that the Russian soldiers demonstrated tenacity. Retreating under the fire of the Ukrainian forces, they tenaciously kept all they had looted in private houses and apartments of residents of Bucha. Russians left behind their munitions to pack their vehicles with stolen computers, TV sets, mobile phones, clothes, carpets, washers, and even toilets. One may find this inclination for stealing toilets too much even for Russians. However, it should be remembered that about a quarter of Russian households still do not have access to indoor plumbing. In rural Russia, the sanitation facilities record is even worse and reaches almost 2/3 of households. Madam President, as we are meeting now, the battle for Ukrainian Donbas is unfolding. The Russian forces are attacking the Ukrainian cities and villages in the east of the country, trying to raze them to the ground and making no differentiation between military and civilians. It means that while the Ukrainian forces courageously protect every parcel of the Ukrainian soil, the civilians in the conflict area remain under deadly threat from the Russian forces. The situation in Mariupol remains the most critical. Thousands of civilians are still in the city. Hundreds of them, including children, have taken shelter in the Azovstal plant. They need immediate safe evacuation, and the Russian forces are well aware of this. Instead, the Russians deny all requests from the Ukrainian side, world leaders, and the UN high officials for evacuation corridors for civilians. The Russians continue to shell Azovstal and the entire city with aerial bombs, rockets, and heavy artillery. The Russians have also blocked humanitarian convoys with food and medicine from Ukraine and international organizations to the city. Every time it seems that we have already got accustomed to the ignoble methods of Russian warfare, and every new piece of news from Mariupol and dozens of other hotspots proves that Russians are still able to hit new lows. I call on the Security Council to urgently exercise its authority in accordance with the UN Charter to save the innocent civilians of Mariupol and other eastern cities and towns who remain hostages of the bloody war fantasies of Putin. I would also like to acknowledge the importance of today's call by the Secretary General for a humanitarian pause to allow for the opening of a series of humanitarian corridors. We demand Russia follow this call. What have we just heard, however, from a Putinite instead? And I quote, "Calls for a ceasefire sound false and insincere," end of quote, followed by a torrent of tommy rot and drivel from the comrade in the Soviet seat. Distinguished colleagues, we commend the UN humanitarian team's continuous efforts to support Ukrainian citizens on the ground. We welcome, in this regard, the UN mission's return to Kyiv. It will ensure better interaction with the government. We welcome the joint actions of the UN World Food Programme and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to provide special cash assistance to low-income IDPs and retirees. We believe that such an approach will contribute to more targeted, balanced humanitarian aid to those in need. We also encourage the UN agencies in assisting the implementation of the governmental programs to relocate Ukrainian production facilities and to support the employment of IDPs. More than 250 state-supported production facilities have already been relocated to other areas, with hundreds of others waiting their turn. We believe that Ukraine is a good place for the active implementation of the humanitarian development nexus. Let me once again express our special gratitude to all states who have accepted Ukrainian refugees, primarily women and children, as well as for providing children's education, health protection, psychological and social support. However, given the enormous magnitude of the crisis, we ask to scale up the UN humanitarian response in and around Ukraine and increase the volume of humanitarian aid and its prompt delivery to those in need. Madam President, in the Russia-controlled territories, including the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, the invaders built filtration camps and torture chambers. They continue to abduct representatives of local authorities and activists. We all remember the assurances of Putin's representative in this chamber that Russia did not intend to occupy the Ukrainian lands. Another lie, as everything coming from his mouth. Now Russians try to tear off the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions following the model of the so-called DPR and LPR. The Russian occupiers continue to forcibly transfer Ukrainians from the occupied territories of Donbass to Russia. And Nazi Germany once did. Filtration camps are an integral element of their transfer. At least 20,000 Ukrainians are kept in filtration camps on the Mangush-Nikolske-Yalta line. About 5,000 to 7,000 people in the filtration camp in the village of Bezymyanna, Donetsk region. According to available information, citizens of Ukraine are sent to the economically depressed regions of the Russian Federation, in particular the northern regions and the island of Sakhalin. Ukrainians receive documents banning them from leaving Russian regions for 2 years. To date, more than 500,000 Ukrainians, including 121,000 children, were forcibly transferred to Russia's territory. Such actions of the Russian invaders can be qualified as kidnapping and require a resolute response by the international community, primarily from the relevant UN agencies. As of today, more than 12 million persons left their homes due to the armed aggression of the Russian Federation, and many of them have no place to come back to. Almost 5 million Ukrainians left Ukraine, including 2 million children, while 7 million, including 2.5 million children, are internally displaced. We call on the UN to provide its assistance to monitor the situation and ensure the safe return of the Ukrainian displaced persons, particularly children, to secure places in Ukraine or other countries. The rights of displaced Ukrainian children must be protected. We also expect more active involvement in establishing humanitarian corridors blocked by the Russian troops, ensuring the safe evacuation of civilians, and delivering humanitarian aid to those who stay in the area of conflict. Since the 5th of March, the government of Ukraine, through the ICRC mediation, offered 348 humanitarian routes. 303 of them were agreed upon, but only 176 took place. As of the 18th of April, more than 290,000 people were evacuated. None of 38 attempts by the Ukrainian authorities to arrange humanitarian corridors for civilians from Mariupol and Volnovakha was successful due to the unwillingness of Russia. Dear colleagues, since January, we have held more than a dozen meetings on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We all value our time, so let me ask you, how do our meetings influence those who occupy a seat that the Charter still allocates to another already defunct entity? How many meetings of the Security Council will be held with the same result without changing Russia's role in the Council? Colleagues, it appears that these meetings do not affect much either the security situation on the front line or the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I do not underestimate the commitment of our partners to help Ukraine at the bilateral level. However, what is the role of the Security Council in this regard? The organ that failed to prevent the war and is still failing due to the Russian actions to stop it now. Unfortunately, in this chamber, we continue to listen to the subjects of a future war trial and make statements before them. For what reason? Are you ready to relegate the role of the Security Council in addressing the war security crisis on the European continent since the Second World War to discussions only? I strongly urge the Security Council to seriously address the issue of how to solve the problem of Russia's dubious presence in this chamber that impedes the Council's effectiveness in exercising its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Why has this organ no influence on Russia's war against Ukraine? The answer is obvious, because the Security Council continues to pretend that Russia is a full and legitimate permanent member. I see no meaningful change in the role for the Security Council if an answer is not found soon. Russia must be stopped for the sake of peace, for the sake of Ukrainians and people throughout the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. Let me start by thanking the briefers for their clear and concise remarks. I also want to pay tribute to the staff of their respective organizations and all other humanitarian workers on the ground in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. We are immensely grateful for their efforts, which sadly are essential for the safety and dignity of so many Ukrainians. UNHCR and IOM are doing impressive work to assist refugees and IDPs, and we encourage you to continue to scale up your work. As we have heard today, and as evidenced by so many testimonies from those who have fled, the efforts of humanitarian actors are dwarfed by the unspeakable horrors caused by the unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal Russian aggression against Ukraine. The decision to launch this war places a heavy responsibility on those who made it. Madam President, we welcome the efforts of humanitarian actors to assist and protect as many people in need as possible, as well as the hospitality and generosity of those countries that are hosting refugees from Ukraine, where Ukraine's immediate neighbors, Poland, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, deserve particular recognition. The Nordic countries are proud to be part of a donor community that has mustered an impressive response to the initial humanitarian appeal of $1.1 billion. Going forward, let me highlight a few elements that we see as particularly important to further improve the efficiency of humanitarian work. First, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured, not least to the areas hardest hit by the conflict, and particularly places which risk being encircled. Access to places like Mariupol and Kharkiv is still granted on a case-by-case basis and requires complicated negotiations, while the humanitarian needs are on a scale that requires sustained access. The main cause for the lack of access are the attacks by the Russian Federation on areas where civilians are located, which compromises the safety and security of humanitarian actors on the ground. We call on the parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations to allow and facilitate access to the east and to other hard-to-reach areas, recalling again the particular responsibility that rests on the shoulders of the invading forces. We welcome in this regard the efforts by the Emergency Relief Coordinator to negotiate a humanitarian ceasefire during his recent visit to Moscow and Ukraine, and we strongly support the Secretary General's call for a humanitarian pause. Second, in line with humanitarian principles, protection and assistance must take into account the needs of everyone living in a situation of vulnerability. We see how women who have chosen to stay are at heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We also see how the elderly and people with disabilities are unable to leave. These aspects must be fully integrated into the humanitarian response. Third, international humanitarian law must be respected. Civilians must never be a target, and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Sexual violence can never be tolerated. This brings me back to the issue of responsibility. No amount of denial and disinformation will prevent accountability for serious international crimes, including war crimes. Madam President, we are now almost 8 weeks into Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine. During that time, we have witnessed horrific atrocities that have ended, ruined, or disrupted the lives of millions. But we have also seen the international community coming together in solidarity with Ukraine. And most importantly, we have been deeply impressed by the incredible resilience of the Ukrainian people. In conclusion, we recall the 2 resolutions from the emergency special session of the General Assembly, as well as the order by the International Court of Justice issued on 16th March this year. All of them include a clear call on Russia to stop this war. But let us be candid. No UN resolution or court orders are necessary in this regard. It is obvious to everyone what the right course of action is. This aggression should never have been launched in the first place, and it must end now. It is never too late to make the right choice. And with that, I thank you so much.
I thank the representative of Sweden for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Madam President, we are thankful to the permanent mission of the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting, and to all the briefers for their insightful remarks. First and foremost, let me take this opportunity to reiterate Italy's firm condemnation of the unjustified and unprovoked aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and our full support to Ukraine and its people. We are deeply concerned by the repeated attacks on civilians, including women and children, and by the testimonies and reports of war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law perpetrated by the Russian armed forces. As the horrifying images we have been seeing in the last month confirmed, human displacement is the inevitable reaction to the scourge of war and the search for the safety of civilians. As it has been mentioned, 7.1 million people are indeed internally displaced, and there are over 4.5 million refugees. Even though these numbers are already shocking, they are continuing to grow as we speak. Refugees are a priority that requires an international and coordinated approach. Hence, we welcome the efforts of IOM, UNHCR, and the other UN agencies on the ground in order to try to alleviate this unbearable human suffering. We provided a contribution of 20 million euros to the UN flash appeal and 6 million euros to the Red Cross. Madam President, Italy has been following migration flows from Ukraine since 2014, also in the light of the presence of a large Ukrainian community in our country. Almost 250,000 Ukrainians live in Italy, accounting for one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in the world before the war. In addition to them, we have already welcomed almost 100,000 refugees, and we are ready to do our part in assisting all the Ukrainians arriving in Italy. Nonetheless, we must point out that the Ukrainian refugees crisis is a protection crisis for women and children that account for 90% of all those fleeing from Ukraine across the borders. We know that the risks of gender-based violence, trafficking, abuse, psychological trauma, and family separation increase in times of conflict and displacement. But given the gender profile of this refugee outflow and the fact that many children have fled alone, these risks are incredibly high. The testimony of rapes and sexual violence by Russian troops that are now emerging are in fact utterly disturbing. The protection and promotion of women and girls' rights and the fight against all forms of sexual and gender-based violence, both in times of peace and armed conflict, is a long-standing commitment of Italy. We believe full accountability must be ensured for the individual perpetrators of such violations, so as to avoid any form of impunity. Madam President, while reaffirming our condemnation of the Russian aggression, Italy reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostility, the withdrawal of the Russian military forces from the international recognized borders of Ukraine, and the return to a negotiating path. We also reaffirm our heartfelt solidarity with Ukraine and its people and mourn all the victims of this senseless war. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I would like to thank the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees and the Director General of the International Organization for Migration for their interventions today. It is important that both the UNHCR and the IOM maintain their presence across Ukraine and support refugees and IDPs in their everyday needs. Madam President, as a consequence of the Russian invasion on Ukraine, we are witnessing one of the gravest displacement and humanitarian crises on record. On March 6th, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, rightly described it as the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the World War II. The rate at which people are fleeing Ukraine is unprecedented, even when compared to the displacement crisis in Venezuela, Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Since day one of the war, Poland has remained open to those fleeing the atrocities of the Russian aggressions. And we registered people of 170 nationalities. All of them are treated equally and accordingly to their legal status. We are now welcoming in our homes most of the 3 million people. Our estimations show that 75% of them voluntarily decided to stay in Poland, and we welcome their choice. Madam President, we need to ask ourselves one very simple question. Since we all agree that this is a crisis of unprecedented scale and the fastest growing crisis since the World War II, have we all, as an international community, responded to it on an unprecedented scale too? Let me be 100% frank with you. The answer is both yes and no. Yes, we have seen the exceptional outpour of solidarity and political support from many corners of the world. Our societies have opened their hearts and homes to the distressed, and our governments have strongly condemned the aggressor and followed with the sanction regimes. The General Assembly had adopted important resolutions. In Poland, we have almost 15 million households. Taking into account that we have welcomed almost 3 million people from Ukraine, Statistically, it means that 1 in 5 Polish families live now with the guests from abroad. The reception of such a big number of refugees requires the Polish government and local authorities to undertake enormous efforts in order to provide shelter, access to healthcare and education. We try to be as flexible with adjusting Polish regulation to the current reality as possible. For example, by today, almost 1 million Ukrainian refugees have received a Polish personal identification number, and around 180 refugee children have enrolled in Polish schools. It solves one of the most challenging problems of any refugee crisis, which is a personal registration. At the same time, it is obvious that Poland and other neighboring countries of Ukraine will not be able to shoulder the burden of this crisis on their own. Even though in Poland we have a simple principle. We help first with our own means, only then we wait for international assistance, not the other way around. It is unprecedented scale that requires an increased involvement of the UN agencies and the support of the whole international community. Only a concerted effort will bring relief for the suffering. And this help must come not in words, but in deeds. Madam President, for the sake of the time, I would like to draw your attention to the following just 3 aspects. First, the need of coordination of our efforts. Since the beginning of the war, Polish government, NGOs, and individual society members have been delivering humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, as well as facilitating deliveries of aid from third countries. In fact, between 1.5 to 2,000 tons of such aid are being shipped every day from Poland. We would like to encourage the UN institutions involved in the relief efforts to use Poland's infrastructure and our resources allow us to reach even the distant regions of eastern Ukraine. As we did just a few days ago with the largest shipment of aid yet, 120 container railway cars with 1.5 thousand tons of aid for Zaporizhia and Kharkiv. Poland and Ukraine have a well-functioning systems of national and local government institutions and logistics, including transportation and storage facilities, and they are ready to use. Today, the Polish Prime Minister opened the first container town for IDPs in Lviv, which was fully funded by Poland. He also announced similar projects to be launched in towns around Kyiv, including Bucha. Shelter like this for 1,000 people costs around $8 million. Therefore, we encourage the United Nations to use this opportunity and work closer with our governments to increase the efficiency of humanitarian assistance provided to Ukraine. Secondly, there is an urgent need to adequately respond to and prevent the risk related to the displacements, such as human trafficking and abuse. Poland has undertaken actions to address challenges related to the risks of trafficking in human beings. In this context, the Polish Border Guard, police, and other authorities have increased their actions to prevent and counter human trafficking. Relevant authorities have undertaken appropriate information campaigns. For example, special alerts containing comprehensive information about the potential threats, possible assistance, and dedicated hotline numbers are disseminated to all refugees entering Poland. Furthermore, to ensure safety of minor Ukrainian citizens, we developed a special procedure by means of which a new legal solution to keep records of unaccompanied minors and their actual caregivers have been introduced. Third, we are deeply concerned by the fate of the people who are forcibly taken far into the Russia's territory. According to what we heard reports, there are 500,000 people who share this plight, including 120,000 children. We see the urgent need for reflection about what can be done by the relevant UN agencies, including the UNHCR and the IOM, to stop and prevent this process. We should make a distinction between those fleeing from aggression and those being forcibly deported, and this distinction is not made in the statistics of the United Nations. Madam President, in view of this enormous humanitarian crisis, much more can be done by the international community to respond to the rapid rising challenges. This is why Poland and Sweden took an initiative to convene on May the 5th the high-level International Donors Conference for Ukraine to mobilize substantial pledges to support the UN humanitarian response in Ukraine and to discuss how to respond to the challenges created by the Russian aggressions against Russian war against Ukraine. The event will be an opportunity to show solidarity with Ukraine and Ukrainian people through practical means, so much needed today. Please show up. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam President. I am speaking on behalf of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We place high importance on the opportunity to take part in the Council discussion today. I thank the briefers for their updates, reflecting the alarming humanitarian situation caused by the brutal Russian military aggression, with the complicity of Belarus against Ukraine. This aggression is illegal and unprovoked. We strongly condemn this violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We repeat the demand of the International Court of Justice and the General Assembly for Russia to immediately stop its aggression and unconditionally withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. The Russian aggression was launched and is being conducted with a cynical indifference to its humanitarian consequences for Ukraine and the world. Cities are reduced to ruins. Homes and farms are destroyed. Families are torn apart. Thousands, including hundreds of children, killed and wounded. Civilians tortured, subjected to sexual violence, summarily executed and burned in Bucha and elsewhere. Rising hunger and poverty in the most vulnerable regions of the world. These are the devastating results of the choice made by Russia. They bring echoes of the worst crimes of the past century that the UN is designed to prevent. 5 million people have been forced to flee Ukraine, most of them women and children. We commend the solidarity of Ukraine's immediate neighbors in helping those fleeing. We continue to assist the nearly 110,000 refugees who have reached Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Millions are displaced as a direct result of the war. Our countries are sending medical and shelter supplies, food aid, and other support to help the people in Ukraine. Our combined humanitarian assistance from state, but also countless individuals, companies, and civil society organizations amounts to 66 million euros. Just as one example, 1 in every 3 Estonians has made a charitable donation to help the people in Ukraine. We are contributing to the UN Humanitarian Flash Appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan and the ICRC. We also continue to provide humanitarian assistance and development cooperation globally. The humanitarian situation of those trapped in the cities under siege has been described as hell. The Russian Federation must grant immediately full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Mariupol and other besieged cities, as well as safe passage to allow civilians to safely and voluntarily leave for a destination of their choice. Madam President, as we discuss the humanitarian consequences of the Russian aggression, we also reiterate our call for accountability for the systematic violations of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. We support the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine as well as the work of the OSCE Moscow mechanism, and continue our support to the Office of the ICC Prosecutor. But we cannot forget that while these investigations are underway, countless civilians continue to be targeted by Russia in Ukraine every day. The Russian attack against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally agreed borders needs to stop now. I repeat, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stand with the people of Ukraine, women, men, and children, who have shown immeasurable courage. We stand with humanity against brutality. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Madam President. Since 24 of February, the Security Council has been actively engaged in the issue of situation in Ukraine and held multiple meetings simply due to one reason, the Russian decision to start the senseless war. Consequences of the Russian unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of international law and principles of the UN Charter are unprecedented and outrageous. We would like to thank today's briefers for the information provided, which unfortunately confirmed our ongoing grave concerns about the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Conflict has already resulted in significant human costs, including a growing number of civilian casualties and damage to critical civilian infrastructure. The numbers of killed and wounded civilians are shocking. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as of yesterday, 2,072 civilians have been killed and 2,818 have been wounded. Needless to say that the reality is actually much worse. Slovakia, as a neighboring and thus directly affected country, is particularly alarmed by the refugee crisis as a result of the Russian aggression. Almost 5 million refugees have fled the country, while far more than 7 million are internally displaced. Since the beginning of the aggression, about 345,000 have entered Slovakia so far. Slovakia adopted numerous legislative measures facilitating the provision of temporary refuge and basic services for people crossing our border. In this regard, I would like to particularly mention that around 7,000 children from Ukraine are provided with adequate education in Slovak schools. Our government, our humanitarian organizations, municipalities, businesses, as well as individual citizens are determined to continue providing strong humanitarian support to relieve the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We stand in solidarity with them as a close friend and good neighbor in these most challenging times. Causing all this suffering is cynical and barbaric. Madam President, to conclude, let me reiterate that the aggressor accountable for this situation is evident. Slovakia calls on Russian Federation to immediately cease its hostilities against Ukraine, in particular of any attacks against civilians and civilian objects. In this regard, we likewise urge the Russian Federation to listen to the voice of the international community and implement the humanitarian resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on 24 of March this year, taking into account the situation of vulnerable groups, including women, children, and older persons who are stuck in Mariupol. Slovakia supports the direct dialogue that started between Ukraine and the Russian Federation and calls on peaceful settlement of the conflict in compliance with the UN Charter. In the light of upcoming Orthodox Easter, we also support the Secretary General's call for 4-day-long truce in order to allow humanitarian corridors. I thank you, Madam President. Slava Ukraini.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.